we're going to go ahead because it's an informational meeting anyway. We'll share the information, and we'll have other members joining us, hopefully, as they navigate the traffic to get here.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
We may be few in number, but the quality is overwhelming of those who are here.
Okay, okay. All right. Luis, yeah, he was talking about you. Right. All right, well, you carry the load down there. Okay. Well, again, welcome, everyone. We are, first up, going to receive the August revenue report. And I think the Secretary here, he had shared this with House Appropriations yesterday. And that's something that just really irritates me slightly. We're going to trick them. The next time we want to go first. So I want all y'all to know we're going to publish a date, but that's not really the date we're going to go, because we're going to go before they go. All right, so y'all be looking out for that in October. We'll see if we can.
Mr. Chairman, it's interesting you bring that up. Even in my myopic world, I've reflected on that, and it is interesting, and I'm sure it is merely coincidental how they always schedule appropriations before the Finance Committee, and once we set the finance retreat on an annual basis, they somehow manage to find an earlier date. And I think in the spirit of collaboration that we just ought to negotiate a detente with them on that, or we'll follow the hanger theory of putting out fake dates.
Well, I'm going to do whatever's necessary, but I want the Daily Press and the RTD to show up and get the fresh news from us. So
well, then you're going to have to talk to them.
All right, Mr. Secretary.
Good morning. Two things before I start. I have nothing to do anymore with the traffic problems on the interstate, so I won't address that today.
But that's your legacy, sir. You were the Secretary of Transportation.
Just wish the current one had it straight. But second of all, on a serious note, I have suggested to both money committees that we ought to alternate these presentations. So I would be in agreement with that if that's something that you guys can reach.
In the worst case scenario, we could hold a joint meeting, I suppose.
That'd be fine too. Just once in front of the firing squad would be all right with me also. Well, good morning. What I thought I'd do today is go quickly through the August revenues, and I'm going to change up a little bit. We normally start where I talk about the economic impacts on the federal and state level, but I'm going to save that because we're entering budget season. And those are going to be the points that are going to go into our economic revenue forecasting model. So I'm going to do that after I talk about the August revenues and where we're going from here, and then about the forecasting schedule, and then a little bit about what we need to consider as we go through the budget. So if that's agreeable with everyone, let's get right into the general fund revenue collections in total. Let me start by saying August is not a significant month. We're really not going to know where we stand on our trends until we get to the end of September. We had a slight increase in revenues for the month of August, mainly because of the way the payroll withholding, and I'll get into, days fell between July and August. But I did want to point out here, too, that while we're showing that we are up 7.3% for the year, 2 points, these are not significant months. We won't know until we get to September really what our trends are. And also, that official forecast of 1.2%, I want to remind the members that includes in it the $797 million we received last year that will not be repeatable this year when we get to the fourth quarter, because we've taken policy adjustments on tax going forward. We won't have those refunds at the level we had in the previous year. Plus, the remaining part of that was wealth generation. And I had a chart at the last meeting that showed when we typically have 2 great years of non-withholding, we don't repeat itself when it relates to tax policy. So I don't believe that 1.2% is realistic. We're going to have to grow substantially more than that in our major categories of sales tax and withholding, and I'll get to that as we go forward. So again, here, nothing really in terms of the overall, except to note that we don't really have a trend until we get to the end of September, which, by the way, will be the last data point that will go into our revenue forecasting models as we go forward. So as we look at withholding tax collections, July had an extra day versus August, the way the payroll held. If you look at the two together, we still had a pretty good 2 months at 7%, but again, not significant in terms of overall collections. And I'll point out here's where I was talking about just a few minutes ago. We've got to grow at 4.2% in this revenue line, which makes up around 63% of our overall budget. We've got to grow at 4.2%, or $550 million over the prior year. I'll remind you, we only grew at 3.6% in the prior year. So we're going to have a very significant showing in payroll. And again, a lot of that came in the last part. The second half of the year was very strong for us because of the issues with tax policy and the differences between the federal and state level. So I point out here that this is a significant goal, and I'll have a few more comments about how that might be impacted in our revenue forecasting as we go forward. But again, nothing really to point out here until we get to September to really get an idea of how the quarter is gone. Now, I mentioned the comment about individual non-withholding. Again, September will be key to that. We'll see if any of that large amount that we got in June related to 2018 taxes and wealth generation is going to continue in this year. But let me point out, I don't think we're going to know the end of that until we get to a year from now, until we get to the end of next year, next June, because that's, remember, is the final time people have to pay in their withholdings. I think a lot of people will look at the safe harbor rules from last year and make sure they pay in at least the amount of what they did in the prior year. So the fourth quarter is really where we're going to really know where this sits for the entire year, which is not great in terms of our overall forecasting because there's uncertainty. But again, I'll point out that in years where we've had large non-withholding payments in 2000, I believe it was one, in 2013 where we had tax policy changes, we expected that to continue. It did not, and that's why we've put a collar on our budgeting and forecasting for non-withholding. So we may get some of this, but it won't show up in our forecast, although I don't believe the majority of it is repeatable. The same goes for individual income tax refunds. Really won't know till we get to September and further in the year whether or not there are some of those high net worth individuals that are due expecting a refund as we process their return. So overall, with the net individual income tax, I guess the best word to say inconclusive as to where we're going, although nothing negative to report, nothing negative to show in our trends as we move forward. Now, there was one good of positive news in sales tax, which is about 17% of our overall revenues, and that is we had a substantial uptick in sales tax related to use tax or internet sales in the month of August. Now, that makes sense because they're reporting July sales, and people would be using it, and therefore the remittances would be due in August. And I'll also point out that July was the prime Amazon day, which is now as big as or bigger than Black Friday used to be in November for the traditional retailers. So a couple of trends that we're seeing, one of which is very positive, and that is we had 1,239 new dealers, or a 4% increase in dealers added because of our Wayfair legislation that went effect July 1st, which is good. And that pretty much trends along with the projections we gave you a year ago this time saying what the impact would be on the Commonwealth. But unfortunately, the other trend that we're seeing is the traditional sales tax continues to decline or moderate. So it looks like we're seeing a cannibalization moving from people buying at traditional bricks and mortar stores into the online sales. The good news is we are now capitalizing on that. One other point, if you looked at a national level, and it doesn't affect our general fund, it affects our sales tax, but vehicle sales really have been propping up at the national level. If you took vehicle sales out of sales tax at the national level, they were actually down. So we need to continue to look at that. That doesn't affect our general fund. Those vehicle sales help our transportation trust fund, but it is a precursor to how general economic activity does. So we're watching. I think a lot of those vehicle sales were related to pending tariffs and trying to get that before the price increases went in. So again, a little bit of good news here. It's not a very substantial month, but it does look like the Wayfair legislation could be supportive of this, at least in terms of making sure we're getting those revenues that we were not picking up related to normal sales tax. Now, we have a few other items for the month of August, quickly go through. Again, inconclusive on net corporate income tax collections. It is not a significant month. We're still decreasing. Remember, we ended last year with a decrease. This was one of the areas where we thought we were going to get a little bit more than we did, but we won't know until we get into September and October. It could be a timing difference, but as we sit here today, nothing really to show that that has been, we have reversed the decline in our corporate income taxes. Remember, most of those are not totally dependent upon just Virginia activity, but regional and other activities outside of our borders. A little bit of good news is in recordation taxes. Interest rates remain low, and so we continue to see a pretty robust housing market in Northern Virginia and here in Richmond, and we saw substantial refinancings. A year ago, we were at close to 5% on a 30-year mortgage. Where we were during this month was about 3.5%. So we saw quite a bit of refinancings going on. And we also saw a couple of other trends. One at our institutions, for instance, UVA has issued a century bond, a 100-year bond at 3.3%. So they took advantage of those long-term rates. There are negative interest rates around the globe, so even at 3.3%, foreign investors, that's a good deal for them. Of course, on the flip side of that is not so good for savers, people that depend on having that in their for earnings on their savings. And another trend we've been closely monitoring is that it looks like municipalities are now, because rates are so low and the difference between tax exempt and taxable debt, the margins have been squeezed, they are now refinancing with taxable debt and taking out the tax exempt. Remember, the tax law put a moratorium on early refinancings of tax exempt debt, but because rates have been so low and the difference between those has been squeezed, we're now seeing taxable debt as an alternative to municipal interest. And if you have that in any of your portfolios, you've seen that municipal bonds really went up a great deal, and now they're tracking back off. We'll have to see how that plays out against our borrowing costs. The good news is, overall, rates remain low in that regard. And of course, in insurance premiums, nothing to report. The first $183.6 million have to be collected, and then we put the remainder into the Transportation Trust Fund. Nothing here that would suggest to me we're not on track to do that again this year in that regard. So if you look overall for the month of August, it shows that year-to-date, we're still trending above our trend line, although, again, I'll point out that 1.2% is not real. We've got to grow 4.2% in actuality to make that. Now, I'll point out the previous year, for the last 10 months, we grew at 8%, but if you go back and look at the graphs, all that came in the last quarter of last year. So because of the tax policy differences that we had. So again, I would just throw out nothing bad to report for August, but inconclusive as to whether or not we're going to be able to be sustainable as we go through this year and making our revenue projections. Our next significant data point, as I pointed out, will be September, where we'll get an early look at the non-withholding collections for the month. And also, as I pointed out, this will be the last data point before we go into our models for revenue forecasting. And of course, we'll see how back-to-school sales taxes were generated, back-to-school shopping season. Most economists predict that back-to-school is going to be okay, but if you look out, many are projecting the Christmas season to be actually flat to down. Based on the, as we go through, I'll go through that in a little bit on our data points. So, Mr. Chairman, in terms of August, that's all I have to report. Nothing really conclusive, nothing bad, but we'll know a little bit more as we get in. Okay. A couple of other things to go through. As you know, we are in the midst of issuing taxpayer relief refunds This schedule you've seen before, and that I wanted to point out we've met all the obligations actually before. We're now into processing the actual checks. In fact, they started yesterday. Our state treasurer, mind you, Garen Nawala, is here, and we issued about 250,000 checks yesterday. They'll be issued between 2.7 million of them between now and October 5th as they go out. So here to point out that we're on track, thanks to the tax department, Craig Burns and his crew is getting us here. Now it's up to Manju to make sure we get them out. But so far, so good in that regard. As you recall, people get checks for $220 a joint return, $110 for single filers if they had a tax liability up to that amount and they did not pay their tax with any type of tax credit. So we estimate somewhere between 2.6 and 2.7 million refunds. And I also should point out that doesn't, if your constituents don't have them by the first week in October, let us know. We'll have it on our websites who to contact. But it could be, as I mentioned last time, some will be caught up in the normal processing about getting more information for their returns and that type of stuff. So it doesn't mean they may not get them. It just means we may need more information. Yes, sir.
While we're on that topic, I certainly applaud what taxation has done, but I would ask this question just out of casual curiosity. How much stress and disruption has it put on taxation in trying to accelerate these payments?
It would actually be both on tax and treasury, and I would say significant. To be honest, I'll let them speak for themselves, but we issue, our normal printers do about 25,000 a week or something in that regard, maybe less, and so we are using an off-site printer to do this. So,
well, my real question is that self-imposed or is that from external encouragement?
Good morning. On an annual basis, Department of Treasury issues under $2 million for the entire year in check payments. So to issue $2.7 million in a matter of 3 to 4 weeks is a heavy lift.
That's my question. Is that a self-imposed discipline to do it in that short period of time, or has there been external pressures of encouragement to do it in that short period of time?
I'll answer. First of all, statutorily, they had to be issued by, I think it was
October 15th.
October 15th.
I understand what it was.
So,
I had something to do with that.
Yes, sir, it did. It did. So that was, and then to make sure we got them out by that time, we reported that we would have to do them not in 1 week. We would have to take about a month to do so. But it did afford us, Mr. Chairman, Senator Norman, the ability to now check our off-site backup facilities. So we had never really tested those, and so Manju and her team have been up in Pennsylvania working with that. So a side benefit has been that we now know that they actually work, or we expect they're going to work for this next month in that. Okay. And I would mention, I'll talk for Craig real quick. Obviously, through all this, we responded to numerous requests from members and money committees about different projections and what it would be. So that's our job. But it did require quite a bit of extra work, and I can report here that I think we gave you good information to make these decisions in that. Okay. So that's just an update on that. And here's where I really want to take just a few minutes to talk about the national and state economic indicators. Normally we go through these just to get an idea of how we're doing to the economy. But what I want to speak on today is these are going to be the data points that go into our revenue estimates, our economic model that John Lehman and his team will be putting together. And you know how that works. We get the model together, then we have economists and business people around the state that look at this. But the point is that these are not going to change significantly between now and the time it goes into the model. We have 1 more month, and so I don't want to say what the actual result's going to be, but I am here to say that it looks as if that model is going to be a lot more conservative this year than it was at this time last year. If you look at first of all, the jobs, let me get to the right place here. I put too many too quickly. If you get to, for instance, payroll employment, we're now on a decreasing 3-month average at the national level. If you look at GDP, We grew at 2% in the second quarter, down from 3.1% in the first quarter. If you look at what most economists at IHS, who are the ones that we use for our model, they're projecting 2.3% this year, 2.2% next year, and 1.7% the year after. As I'll point out, this time last year, the year we were in, we were looking at over 3% growth. That's now been revised downward to 2.3% growth for the year. There are lots of things that may weigh into that. Tariffs could certainly be a part of that as we go forward. If that gets satisfied, maybe that will be helpful. We did see now oil prices are going to probably spike, at least in the short term, because of the activity in Saudi Arabia. But again, whether we think it's right or wrong, those are going to be the data points that go into this model. I'll pull out where we have been at full employment in the Commonwealth. I mentioned this last time, for almost 18 months to 2 years, an unemployment level of under 2.9%, and the same way at the national level at 3.7%. So getting workers qualified, getting workers to take the jobs to continue growth is going to be an impediment at full employment, where a couple years ago we were not there and had those employees to work into the line. Probably the two things that cause me the most concern are at the bottom of the page. First, I'll mention, it's not here, but the yield curve inversion, which happened a couple times a few months ago. While not a 100% indicator, it's pretty daggone good and 12 to 18 months out that at least a slowdown, if not a recession, would occur. But probably one that's more alarming to me is the one that is mentioned, and that's the Institute of Supply Management Index, which has fallen below 50%. Every time that has happened, not just every once in a while, every time that's happened, we've gone into a slowdown sometime in the future. So not trying to have a crystal ball, but looking back, if history is any guide, we are looking at a model that's going to give us a lesser amount of revenue than it did a year ago. And if you look at the next page, if we look at Virginia, from our perspective, again, we've been at full employment. And we've seen job growth was right at 1% last year, slightly under or right at 1%. We need to grow in withholding 4.2%. So that's either going to come from wage growth or other issues. I'll also point out that concerning is this is the first time in our history the Federal Reserve is putting an easing of monetary policy in times where we're in a growth. So I don't know where we're going to go to stimulate to the extent we fall down in regard in that. And of course, it punishes, I mentioned, for savers. Now, here's how this all plays out. I mean, whether or not we can have a debate of whether this is going to continue or not, it's going to be inputs into the model. 80% of our revenues, that is withholding and sales tax, 80% tied to the economy, we have been growing at 3.5%, roughly 3.5%. That is $600 million annually, roughly $600 million in new revenue. 74% of our budgeted expenditures between health and education, which many are either mandated or matches with federal, 74% are growing between 5 and 7% per year. Now, at 5%, that's $800 million a year. At 7%, it's $1.1 billion per year. So as I mentioned yesterday, we have a structural math problem. If 75% of our budget's growing at 5 to 7%, but our revenues, 80% are only going at 3.5, we need some extraordinary event to make that difference up. And I'm not saying what that should be. I'm not saying it should be revenues or cuts, but we're going to have to deal with that difference. And with these inputs, I fully expect a fairly significant reduction probably in this year and outgoing as compared to where we were a year ago and look at our modeling. I'm not saying it's going to be a recession, but it may feel like one because of the situation that we're in, having to make up that difference in revenues. Now,
Okay, yeah. Question here.
Yes, Senator Norman.
Mr. Secretary, I realize that it's very early to be forecasting, but based upon what you have just shared with us between the anticipated revenue growth and the increased expenses just in healthcare and mandated expenses, as the administration starts to put together a budget, are they going to use these factors as a benchmark and be constrained in what they are proposing in new initiatives and spending?
We are required to have a balanced budget.
I understand
And
that.
that.
That wasn't my question.
Yes. And so, but part of the reason for my message today is exactly for that, to have a realistic understanding of where we are. I can tell you, I should have wore a purple tie because I'm battered and bruised from all the budget requests that we've got in that. And the message to our staff and to our agencies is that we are going to be in a constrained year. So while I won't put adjectives on it, and I won't know if there will be any additional revenues that would be, those policy decisions haven't been made, but certainly any new initiatives, we're going to have to find the money to pay for those.
But if you wore a pink tie, you would demonstrate you were impervious to those requests.
Yeah. I didn't say I said yes, I just said I've just listened to it. I listened to all those. But no, I do believe that it is going to require, and it's the reason I bring it up now, it's no sense getting to December when the governor speaks and we all of a sudden throw this out there and say, we've got this issue. I think we need to be much more pragmatic. Now,
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Senator McDougal.
before we move off this point, you said education and healthcare were the two significant drivers?
they're 74%, if you look at the general fund, they're 74% of our expenditures.
Mr. Chairman, so can you break those down, what the healthcare is versus what the education is?
Yes, I can tell you the two major components, and I was going to have a graph on this next month as we get into it, but obviously, base Medicaid expansion and that reforecast, not the expanded Medicaid, but base Medicaid forecast has been growing significantly. That's the 50% match traditionally. There's some that are a little bit more than that of our budget. So that is a big driver of it. On the education side, it's the standards of quality and the re-benchmarking.
Mr. Chairman, so of that 74% of the budget, how would you break it down between those two? It's like,
I would say in the general range, if you look at the history, re-benchmarking has been somewhere between $500 and $700 million when we do this. Medicaid expansion somewhere between $600 and $800 billion. Not expansion, Medicaid reforecast, $600 and $800 billion. So a substantial part of the new revenues in that regard. Now, there's some other issues I'll get to later, just quickly, but that's not that's just the facts. I'm not trying to say it's good or bad. It's just what it is. And we haven't seen those forecasts. Maybe we'll get some benefits as we go forward. I know there's been a lot of different things in the base forecast I've been working with Medicaid with. You'll hear later on from Health in that regard. So I think we'll have a better handle on some of the reforms they put in. But the numbers are going to be the numbers based on the usage. Yes, sir.
Senator Norman.
Yesterday in front of JLARC, the subject about Medicaid expansion came up, and I believe the young lady had testified in front of the House Appropriations. Excuse me, I believe the young lady had made a presentation in front of House Appropriations yesterday, and the question came up about the fiscal impact if the federal administration denies the promoted workfare component that was marketed as being an integral aspect of Medicaid expansion, that if he didn't improve that, and I asked her what that number was, and she very awkwardly deflected it, saying she would share it with us today. As I look at the agenda, I don't see that they are on the agenda today. So with your insight, do you have an approximate number that if the workfare component is not paid for by the feds, what that is going to cost us in additional revenues?
Two comments. I know Dr. Carey, I don't know if Dr. Carey's here. He did, during that presentation, say it was going to be $50 million or more. He made that comment yesterday per annual. I remember the fiscal impact of last year. There was a range somewhere between 20 million, as I recall, on up to 80 million in those ranges based on what was put in. So I don't think any decisions have been made. And Dan, you want to have?
That's all right. I accept what you say.
Okay. So that's the two things, the data points I have is Dr. Carey's comment yesterday and then the fiscal impact from last year.
Thank you, sir.
All right, now, what I did point out here, we won't just take these numbers blindly. We have this revenue forecasting schedule where the Joint Advisory Board of Economists, and your staff sits on that, along with House Appropriations and my staff, have input, and we go through and get economists from around, not only just the state, but really around the country, come in and give us their outlook. I'll point out, though, at least one of those, last year, the bias was our base plus a little bit of upside, as I recall. This year, I think that may be reversed based on what I've been seeing in their comments. Mark Zandy, one of our members of our board, has now placed a recession in 12 months out at 67%. So I don't think we'll get a bullish update from him, but we're going to get their input. And of course, the Governor's Advisory Council on Revenue Estimates will be businessmen, and many of you sit on that. We'll have an input before the final revenue estimate is put out to hear from businesses across the Commonwealth and their comments. So I don't want to say we're going to just blindly take these data points. They're a robust discussion, but I will point out that the base we'll be starting from appears to be much more conservative than it was a year ago in that regard, looking out. So I just wanted to make that known to the members as we go through here. Finally, just point out a couple of other things. This gets to Senator McDougall's comments that I asked earlier. I had put in here the annual Medicaid forecast and the standards of quality in there. But two things, I won't go through the whole list. You're going to hear some presentations later on today. The Virginia retirement system did announce they did not make their 7%, 6.7%. I can't answer for the board, but I would expect that they may vote to have a reduction of the discount rate. Every 25 basis points, or 0.25%, is $96.8 million to the general fund each year. So that could be a couple $100 million more that we would have to do. And I know you're going to hear from Kevin Hall a little bit later about the lottery sales. He'll go that into more detail, but they have trended off significantly in the last quarter, and he'll have more to share on that. So, Mr. Chairman, again, the purpose of that was just to get to the members that I do believe we're going to have our work cut out for us. And while I'm not suggesting that the Commonwealth is not growing, I am suggesting that we're going to have to be cautious and frugal and understanding where we're getting these any new programs and budgets and things from. So with that, that is the end of my presentation. If there's any questions.
Mr. Secretary, are you going to be around for a bit?
Yes, sir. I'll stay for the presentation.
Okay. If there are questions for the members, our next presenter has to leave about 10:30, so I want to make sure she has adequate time.
I'll stay around.
If you'll be around for any questions, we'll come back to you. Thank you,
Yes,
Mr.
sir.
Secretary. All right, our next presenter is the Acting Commissioner of Behavioral Health, Mara. Someone we've known for a long time, but not in this capacity, so welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Senator Hanger, Senator Norman, members of the committee, thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you today. Let's see where the clicker went. So I have a clicker right here. Okay. I'm here to speak to you today about recent steps DBHDS has taken to open 56 temporary beds at Catawba State Hospital. Catawba Hospital is one of the 9 state psychiatric hospitals the Commonwealth operates, this one operating in Salem, Virginia, near Roanoke. This summer, we initiated action to open 28 temporary beds in FY20 and 28 additional beds in FY21 in response to increasing census pressures on our state hospitals. So we were asked to cover our rationale, the latest information on the hospital census, estimated costs and how it will be funded, and current efforts to address the census issues. So many of you will be familiar with what the so-called bed of last resort legislation. Very briefly, starting in July 1, 2014, a new law required that individuals under a temporary detention order be admitted to a state hospital at the end of an 8-hour emergency custody order period if no alternative bed is found. And this slide here, I can summarize this for you in a few sort of short bullet points, shows you the impact of the legislation on the state hospital system. In summary, since the onset of the last resort legislation, our state hospitals have seen a 333% increase. That's 333% increase in TDO admissions since the law was enacted. And statewide, just to tell you, sort of give you a brief update on our average census, state hospitals have been averaging a census of 96% capacity, and at times this has grown to over 98% of capacity. Just yesterday, we were at 101% of our operating capacity, with 7 hospitals full or operating over their capacity. To tell you sort of how this translates in reality, in a system of 1,332 beds, we have 5 beds that help to ensure that DBHDS meets its statutory obligations, which I'll cover in just a moment. This is just a brief snapshot looking specifically at calendar year 2019. So this really is sort of an every other week census tracking, starting in January, running through the beginning of July. You can see some sort of seasonal fluctuations along the way, but if your eye starts at the bottom and moves to the top, you can simply see the upward trajectory of our census pressures and growth of our census at our state hospitals. One important point to point out, during the fourth quarter of FY19, we compared our state census growth to the previous quarters, fourth quarter in FY18. In FY19, our average daily census was 96% and trending up. And FY18, our average daily census was 94%. So again, the takeaway message here is a very increasing, clear upward trend. Just to cover briefly again, our obligation to meet our statutory commitments under 37.2 and 19.2. The first one requires DBHDS to admit all individuals under a TDO at 8 hours if no suitable bed is found in a private hospital or other facility. The second one relates to mandates on the forensic population requiring DBHDS hospitals to admit incompetent defendants for treatment to restore their competencies to stand trial within 10 days. And really, I think the takeaway here is that no matter how high the census pressures are, these mandates require that patients are accepted into state-run facilities. Again, just a little bit of background. I think many of you are familiar here. I can sort of share some of the snapshots. Overall, the number of TDOs statewide actually remains pretty steady year to year at about 25,500 per year. What we're seeing is that TDO admissions to private hospitals has dropped. So just to take you through some of the data starting in FY15, we saw 91% of all TDO admissions to private hospitals drop from 91% in FY 2015 to 79% in FY 2018. We were also just able to look at the closeout data from FY19 to compare FY18 to FY19, and TDO admissions to private hospitals did drop even further from 18 to 19, from 79% to 77%. So the converse of that is an increasing census pressure in accepting those TDOs to the state hospitals. Sure.
This is not an area that I focus in, but I'm looking at the graph on slide 6, and the total DDOs, as you suggested, is sort of stabilized at 25,000. But as I'm looking at the TDOs to private hospitals, looks like it goes from a peak of 22.6 down to 19.3, so a decline of, say, 3,300. And then I look at the TDOs to the state hospitals, and it's gone up from 2,200 to 5,900. And why, in the shift in admissions, are there some economic conditions out there, or availability of beds, or other intrinsic financial issues?
So Senator Norman, I think your question gets at the heart of the matter here, which is the obligation of the state hospital system to meet the statutory requirements as set out under 37.2 and 19.8 or 6. So whereas the majority of TDOs are still accepted by the private hospital system, we are seeing an increasing number coming over into the state hospital system because the private hospitals are no longer accepting them. So that goes back to this growth in the TDO admissions to private hospitals dropping. So in FY 2019 at 91%, down to that same TDO admissions to private hospitals in 2018, 79%. So we're seeing that proportion essentially creep over into the state hospital system.
Follow-up. Is there any kind of inducement that we can provide to the private hospitals to perhaps accept more of the TDOs?
So Senator Norman, that question, I was also asked to address the activities to date and work that is being done around just that issue. And so in a few slides, I'll cover some of the activities and the things that are being looked at by a number of stakeholders and partners. In terms of our plan for the temporary beds at Catawba, so this summer we did initiate action to add 28 additional beds at Catawba State Hospital in FY 28 additional beds in FY 2021 for a total of 56 beds. In terms of the timeline, we're looking at the first 6 to 8 beds roughly by the end of November, with the full first 28 coming online by June of 2020. Important to note here that the 28 beds will be geriatric beds in response to a very critical pressure point within the system to serve that population and an extremely high census at Piedmont Geriatric Hospital in Burkeville. We will be using 4.15, actually 5.15 in DBHDS special funds in FY 20, and a budget request will be prepared for FY 2021 for $9.3 million and FY 2022 for $10.3 million. And the reason Catawba was selected is because it currently has unused patient treatment areas. These are units that could be prepared and staffed up with relative ease in relation to other state hospitals in the system, and also because they have an existing expertise in serving the geriatric patient population, and so we want to leverage and maximize the training and expertise that already exists in the system. Just a quick note on existing hospital capital and infrastructure initiatives that are already underway. We wanted to be very clear and point this out, that these do not relate to the addition of the temporary beds. These were projects that were underway or future projects that are planned as funding is available. And probably important to say that many of the projects slated either in progress or for future progress relate to what are called life and health and safety requirements. So ensuring that we are meeting our obligations under healthcare accrediting body, Joint Commission, that sort of thing. We were also asked to address current efforts around addressing the census pressures. And as you recalled earlier in the presentation, the last resort and also the forensic mandates are key factors that impact our ability to control the front doors of the state hospitals. Nevertheless, we are working and have been working on a number of actions to impact the census crisis, such as decreasing overall need and reliance on acute inpatient psychiatric care through the development of STEP Virginia and proposed behavioral health redesign. Both of these would add much-needed step-down levels of care and bring on much-needed crisis services to meet people in the community when they are at a point of crisis. Also working with the private hospitals to specify needed resources that would allow them to manage and treat more complex individuals and their systems, such as those with co-occurring substance use disorder. And also through the SB 1488 work group, which was a legislatively mandated work group to identify short-term and long-term recommendations to impact through policy processes, the impacts of the civil commitment law. Lastly, thought it would be important, again, just to, many of you may have seen this before or be familiar with this in terms of Virginia's utilization of behavioral health dollars. I think probably the sort of key thing to point out here, the green line that you'll see trending up stands for where the national average is in terms of investments in community health care, community mental health care, rather. Red being the national average for investments in inpatient hospital care. And where they intersect, sort of in the middle of the slide there, is where nationally the spending is roughly equal. And I don't know if you can see it on the slide, but if you drop down, that's to about the early 1990s. And then the blue right there highlights Virginia spending in FY 2020, where we are at about sort of 50% roughly of the mental health spending in the hospitals and 50% in the community. And I think while sort of the takeaway here is that while the last resort legislation ensures that no person under a TDO will be without a hospital bed, it's not really fully supported by a comprehensive system to care for individuals who present in crisis. So certainly many things are happening. The census crisis is occurring in the context of many behavioral health reforms and initiatives, and we greatly appreciate your collaboration and the work that you have done to support that move. And I think probably another takeaway is to the extent that the last resort has sort of resulted in creating community awareness and creating awareness about critical, dire needs in the community, that is something that certainly has occurred. And the work group of the SB 1488 group is looking at all of the possible recommendations to bring to bear. Again, in conclusion, adding beds, we are looking at that as a temporary and emergent necessity. And these beds would be in place until the state hospital census trajectory plateaus or decreases.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Happy to take any questions.
Now, let me preface before we have questions. Mira has a hard stop deadline at 10:30 because she has an important meeting on our training centers that she needs to get to. Senator Barker, you wanted to ask something. I first want to share that we've had a fairly robust conversation over the last week with the administration, with Dr. Carey and with Mira and others. I, for one, have not bought into their plan. I think we need some additional conversation about it. The last graph there would indicate to you that in Virginia, in the aftermath of the Olmstead decision, we didn't move as quickly and agilely as some of the states did to funding community-based services, and we're at a critical point right now. I would also say the private hospitals are at the table, and I think that Senator Norman, they're being cooperative, and there is some area there where we may be able to negotiate something to alleviate this. And there's a lot that we could get into this morning, but in the interest of Mira's time, because I want to make sure she makes this meeting because it's very important. But I, for one, think we need to continue to discuss this with staff and with members, but before you all move too far down that road. Senator Barker?
Sure, just quickly. I mean, obviously, we discussed a lot of these issues through the Deeds Commission and had a lot of information presented. One of the things that became evident late last year was that all of the increase between FY14 and FY17 in terms of TDOs was in Northern Virginia. And so and that has clearly had a huge impact upon the TDO placements, both at the community hospitals and at the state hospitals. And Northern Virginia Mental Health Institute has basically been turned from mostly a voluntary hospital to nearly all TDO at this point. We'd asked for a study to be done on that. Can you fill us in on sort of where that stands right now and any information you have from that at this point?
Absolutely, Senator Barker. In terms of the study, we are working with the community partners and the regional partners up in the Northern Virginia area. There have been several, I believe they call them regional mental health collaboration meetings with private partners, hospitals, private providers, the community services board systems, and we will be prepared to submit the study with the recommendations and findings by the deadline, I think, is November, something along those lines. And we'll be able to speak more significantly and comprehensively to the questions about the situation with the TDOs in Northern Virginia.
Okay.
I don't have exact information off the top of my head, but we're certainly happy to continue to work on that. And we're obviously, tracking and participating in the regional mental health work group in Northern Virginia.
Senator Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just really want to commend Commissioner Signer for her composure, because I just can't look at these numbers and not emphasize what a crisis this is. Hospitals are not designed to run at 98 to 101%. They're designed to run at 88%. And the statutory obligations that we are currently asking you to comply with are virtually impossible to comply with. And when you consider that several of our mental health hospitals still run on paper, don't even have electronic medical records, I feel very strongly that we need to look at this much more comprehensively than we're looking at this. It's not just a TDO issue. This is a comprehensive issue for this patient population that involves all of the new and evolving information we have about community-based services, evidence-based trauma-informed care, supportive housing, TDOs, private-public partnerships, and making sure we have places for people in crises. I don't know that we have allowed this to rise to a high enough priority for us, because I think we need to comprehensively look at this if we really want to solve this problem. And for me, I will tell you, I was in the ER on Saturday night at Henrico Doctors Hospital with a patient that was there for over 24 hours with a police officer who was taken off duty to sit in that room with that patient because we were at 100% and there was no room. This is a crisis, and there are individuals that even if they get a TDO are not necessarily getting what they need to succeed in Virginia. And I just can't emphasize enough how much I think we need to take a different approach to solving this problem.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here, and certainly Dr. Carey, Daniel, we will continue to discuss this. And I know you have a tough task at hand, but you all got a lot of work in progress. One of the things I would quickly want to share, because of the national and state attention it's getting right now, is a lot of focus with the gun debate, a lot of focus being put on people with mental illness. And I would suggest that most mentally ill are not violent. The people that are perpetrating these deeds are mentally stressed. And I think all of us these days are a bit mentally stressed. And so we need to put that in perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator.
Now, another fun subject here, the lottery. Kevin, you were
How are you, Senator Hanger?
doing very good today. Good to have you here with us today.
Members of the committee, appreciate the opportunity. What I'd like to do with your forbearance is do just a quick recap of FY19, look at the first 2 months of results for FY20, talk briefly about our business plan going forward, and then speak in a little bit more detail about a couple of concerns we have about changes in the overall gaming environment that are already starting to have an impact on our business. By every measure, as you know, FY19 was a stellar year for the lottery. Record sales of nearly $2.3 billion over the fiscal year, which allowed us to hand off to you record profits of $650 million. Because of your role on this committee, you may have interest in the second level of information, the $6.5 million in unclaimed prizes that were deposited in the Literary Fund, which, as you know, also supports K-12 education. We also collected nearly $5 million in state income tax withholdings. And because we participate in the debt offset program, we also were able to collect $2.5 million in overdue taxes, fines, child support, and the like. Quick reminder of where lottery dollars go. 61% go right back out the door in the form of prizes to our customers. Our retailers share about 6% in commissions and incentives. We run a lean enterprise. We spend about 5% of revenue on our operations, and 28% of revenue goes into the Lottery Proceeds Fund, which the legislature then, working with Department of Education, appropriates for K-12 public school programs across the state. Looking at the first 2 months of this fiscal year, sales are softening. They're down 6.5%, which year over year is nearly $24 million behind where we were at this point last year. Concurrently, we have paid out less in prize money, which has offset that decline in sales over the 2-month period, which has allowed us to eke out a very narrow profit of $2.4 million for July and August. Looking ahead, we're going to continue to focus on making the product more accessible in more places to more customers. Over the past 2 years, we've deployed nearly 2,000 of these touchscreen vending machines, many in grocery and drugstore locations. These are very popular with our players, very popular with our retailers. The retailers that have the vending machines tend to perform better than those that don't. And we can point to a direct $60 million sales lift in the past year as a result of the deployment of these touchscreen self-serve vending machines. We also currently are beginning deployment into 80 Walmart stores across Virginia after several years of conversations with them. And we are continuing to talk to other significant bricks and mortar retailers about vending. In May, we rolled out Mobile Play, which is our first foray into the digital space. It's a smartphone app that connects a customer's smartphone by Bluetooth to the lottery terminal in an existing licensed retail location. We've had about 200,000 customer downloads so far. It allows us to provide several convenience features that are popular with our customers, also a suite of e-games that are proving popular as well. It also has allowed us to approach non-traditional retail partners, restaurants, bars, arcades, places like Topgolf, and food courts, and license them with a terminal that also, while the customer is within that footprint, they can connect to a lottery terminal and engage with some of our products. I will tell you that the performance has lagged behind our expectations at launch. I think we are bumping up against the statutory restriction on online sales. I also would note that that restriction was imposed in 2006, which was a year before the smartphone was introduced. And I think we all know how mobile technology has transformed retail and transformed consumer expectations about what they feel like they should be able to do in terms of e-commerce. We also have been engaging extensively over the summer, as you might imagine, with the JLARC team, which is conducting the study into expanded gaming across the Commonwealth. We're also conducting our own kind of concurrent study because of the tight deadlines that are envisioned by the legislation as introduced. We have an internal lottery team that is doing a deep dive on regulatory structures used in other states where lotteries have absorbed additional gaming oversight responsibility. We want to have a solid baseline of knowledge so that we can move expeditiously depending on what JLARC presents and what the legislature chooses to do as a result. Also, over the remainder of FY20, we will continue to use our marketing channels to make the point about what distinguishes the lottery from other forms of gaming, and that is our constitutional commitment to raise revenue for Virginia's K-12 public schools. Over the 30-year life of the Virginia Lottery, our players have helped contribute a combined $9 billion for your use in funding education programs. My last two monthly revenue letters to the administration and to the leadership of the legislative money committees have made note of some developments in the gaming space that are causing concern at the Virginia Lottery. The two changes in that environment specifically would be the advent of historical horse racing and also what we see as an alarming spike in the deployment of so-called games of skill around Virginia. We call them gray machines because it's our belief that they're operating in a gray area of state law. But we've now done some data analytics on both of those developments, looking specifically at historical horse racing, which was launched in April and now encompasses the New Kent track and also Benton and South Richmond with Hampton to come. It is our belief that to date, the introduction of historical horse racing has had little to no impact on lottery sales. Our hypothesis is that historical horse racing appeals to a different consumer who's looking for a different type of gaming experience. I would note also that each Rosie's location is a licensed lottery retailer. They have a lottery kiosk at each of their facilities, which we appreciate. To test the hypothesis, we zoomed in on Benton and the 15 licensed lottery retailers located within a 1.5 mile radius of the Benton Rosie's. Generally speaking, all 15 of those retailers were performing close to the overall state average in terms of lottery sales and sales growth. In May, when the Rosie's facility opened, half of those retailers continued to perform at about the state average. The other half that didn't, where we saw sales declines, had installed these gray machines at their locations. We've been tracking closely and with interest and growing concern, as I mentioned, the rapid deployment of these gray machines. And we have 85 people at the lottery, salespeople, that are in and out of our 5,300 retail locations every week. Earlier this year, I instructed them to start keeping a count of how many of these machines they were seeing inside the retail locations where we do the bulk of our business. This is the arc of the growth. A couple of footnotes on this slide. This is our count. by our people. We're only counting machines in lottery licensed retail locations. We're not making any effort to count the deployment of these machines in restaurants or bars or vape shops or the like. And one more footnote, there are several manufacturers and operators of these devices in the market. We're not making any distinction about whose machine it is. We're just counting the number of machines that are operating alongside our product in the retail space. In April, we counted just under 1,000. By June, it was 3,300. By July, it was 3,800. In August, it was 4,500 of these machines sprouting up in the retail space where we do the bulk of our business. This is a heat map, if you will, to make the point that this is a statewide phenomenon. And again, this is just measuring inside the retail space where we do our business. I'd also note that in the week we've spent preparing this presentation for today, we counted an additional 200 machines in 100 additional stores. So the proliferation continues. We have some policy concerns that I think are worthy of your consideration. Overall, that these are unlicensed, unregulated, untaxed devices. There's no requirement that they enforce age restrictions on the use of them. There's no obligation that they provide any resources or even information about responsible gaming protections. Generally speaking, we can't determine that they're linked to any kind of a gaming system where there would be an audit trail of the revenue being produced by these machines. Because they are operating in large numbers alongside our existing product, we have a concern that players are presuming that these are Virginia lottery devices and that their spend in these machines is also benefiting the designated beneficiary of lottery profits. And obviously, any diversion of lottery spend towards these machines impacts not only our revenue flow, but the profits that we are able to produce each year for your use on K-12 programs. In our effort to fully understand what's going on in the marketplace, we also launched a survey of just over 2,000 adult Virginians, an online poll through the month of July to try to get a sense of consumer attitudes towards the introduction of these machines into the marketplace. 37% indicated they thought they were lottery devices. 21% reported they were spending less on the lottery as a result of the availability of these machines. 23% self-reported that they were spending $100 or more a month on the gray machines, which compares to 8% of lottery players who self-report that same level of spend. This chart and graph was eye-opening to us. It overlays actual sales results we're seeing for lottery products in June, July, and August with the growth curve of the number of these machines that are in the market. And the correlation is pretty clear. If we attempt to annualize this phenomenon over the remaining months of the fiscal year, with the rate of deployment of these machines continuing at where it is now, we are estimating that at the end of this fiscal year, it could have upwards of a $140 million impact on our sales and a resulting nearly $39 million impact on the profits that we hand over to the legislature for appropriation. We also have been tracking what's going on the ground in specific localities. Many of you probably know that in the city of Charlottesville, the Commonwealth's attorney warned retailers that it was his belief that these devices were illegal gambling devices, and he suggested that they remove them, which I believe was done quickly. There's now litigation around the prosecutor's action. Also, in the city of Danville, zoning officials raised some concerns about occupancy levels and parking, and the Planning Commission has ordered the machines to be removed or temporarily unplugged while they sort out those issues. So we looked closely, specifically at the Charlottesville market, to see if we could see an impact following the removal of the machines. And we have, in fact, started to see that our sales are snapping back to a statewide average once the machines were removed from that market. This is not just a Virginia phenomenon. The skill game industry is active nationwide in an aggressive effort to deploy their product. I'd like to point out two approaches taken by other states. The Georgia Lottery, since 2013, has been regulating these types of devices. It requires about 50 full-time people, and they engaged in more than 600 enforcement actions in the past fiscal year in regulating this industry. Importantly, in Georgia, these machines do not and never have dispensed cash prizes. It's always been a voucher for store merchandise or for lottery products. And the system that was devised in Georgia is that the lottery gets 10% of the profits from this revenue stream. Then they back out the cost of enforcement and administration of the program. And in the last fiscal year, that resulted in $66 million deposited by the lottery for their designated beneficiary as a result of these machines. In Pennsylvania, as we speak, there are a couple of approaches that are under discussion by the Pennsylvania legislature. There is an effort to erect guardrails around the skill machine activity with limits on the number of devices per location and a revenue stream for the state as a result. The Pennsylvania Lottery has aligned with the Pennsylvania State Police and, perhaps not surprisingly, Pennsylvania's casino industry in a legislative effort to actually ban the activity. That discussion is ongoing in Pennsylvania right now. Pennsylvania Lottery has come up with similar estimates as we have as far as lost sales, potential lost profit. And it looks like the machines are in about the same percentage of their retailers as we're seeing here, about 20%. So Chairman Hanger, Chairman Norman, that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you. And I expect there will be a few questions. Senator Norman, you got some?
Thank you for your presentation, and I continue to appreciate what the lottery is doing. The questions I have are focused on generously what you refer to as gray machines. If I look in a broader perspective, Virginia right now is dealing with lottery, pari-mutuel, historical horse racing, casino legislation, and gray machines. The atmosphere has grown significantly in recent years in an accelerated pace. Am I correct in assuming that right now there is very little, if any, statutory constraints on these, quote, game of skills, which I deny that euphemism?
I'm sure you're aware of the legal distinction between games of chance and games of skill. I think one of the challenges we're running into is that there are multiple manufacturers and game providers with multiple game models, some of which make more of an effort to meet the legal distinction of game of skill than others. And they're proliferating our view, based upon some guidance that was offered by ABC year and a half, 2 years ago, which was asked to look at one manufacturer's machine and determined that it was a game of skill, and that therefore ABC as an agency would not be initiating enforcement activity against licensees based on the presence of this machine. I would suggest that as we have watched closely, that determination has been mischaracterized by others in a pretty aggressive marketing campaign to, in effect, purport to offer some kind of broad license for this industry to enter in the market. And because the Attorney General's office opines on issues of law, not fact, and I would never presume to speak for the Attorney General's office, nor for ABC for that matter, I think the proliferation of different models by different manufacturers means that a legal analysis could differ based on the specific machine you're talking about. So again, my non-lawyer's understanding is that the Attorney General's office has determined that since localities enforce gambling laws, that this is an issue best left in the hands of local Commonwealth's attorneys.
All right, well, let me
was a really
sort of
long
get
answer.
a little more specific. I think the AG wimped out on it, and the discussion has been on local jurisdiction prosecutorial discretion. And there's a very easy way to address that, and that's through statutory implementation, which makes it very clear on that. Does the lottery would the lottery be willing to accept oversight on these type of machines if the appropriate statutory legislation was implemented?
That is that is a decision that's slightly above my pay grade, obviously. I would point out that we do have concerns about the conduct of this industry and the impact it's having on our fiduciary obligation in the marketplace. And I would simply also point out the Georgia model, that effective regulation requires considerable bandwidth in terms of people.
Well, my
and
assumption
enforcement
would be
activity.
that you would be given that bandwidth, and I appreciate that even the lottery has to be responsive to the legislature's enactment of laws, but it occurs to me in my very sophomoric perspective on this, which isn't quite as sophomoric as it may sound, based upon prior experience I've had with other products a number of years ago, is that I think in Virginia, for a variety of reasons, that it is unregulated. I question what the public benefit is, and don't try to sell me on this philanthropic contribution foolishness, that there are not revenues being collected on it. It's competing against a clearly lawful product that we have on it, that either we need to statutorily constrain it and regulate it, or we need to ban it. And I would say there is a lot of room in between there, but I think it would be very naive to think that some well-intended legislator would not offer some comprehensive legislation to constrain this, not the least of which is perhaps even a prohibition of having it co-located in venues where the lottery is. They ought not be competing right in the lottery venues that we have. So I would look forward to having an ongoing discussion with you and see if there is any movement between now and January on self-regulation because absence the tempering of the prolific spread of these machines, absent a public benefit, absent any state benefit, that could determine the tenor of legislation that may appear in 2020.
I deeply appreciate your observations, Senator Norman, and also look forward to continuing the conversation.
Okay. Other comments? Yes.
Thank you,
Senator
Mr.
Ruff.
Chairman. I agree with a lot of what Senator Norman said, but I want to get a little finer point on it. In May, you started doing the online. If you removed the online from the on-premise sales, what percentage down would you be for July and August?
One technical correction, it's not online. It's a Bluetooth connection to the phone device while you're inside the store. Right.
Okay.
In fact, the number one complaint we hear is, what do you mean I got to be standing in the store to use it? As I mentioned, the sales results have not been what we had anticipated.
Okay. Others have anything to add? Senator Ruff is our expert on gambling. Well, actually, Senator Lucas probably is our expert on gambling. You've got a long-standing position in opposition to gambling, haven't you?
Mr. Chairman, I would say that it is causing a lot of concern with different localities, different sheriffs, different Commonwealth attorneys, so that whatever we do, we have to have a consistent state policy. If it in one county, one of my counties, they won't, the Commonwealth attorney won't touch it. In another county, they will take it to court, and then the Commonwealth attorney says, well, he's a good merchant, good businessman in our community, so don't do anything to him. So, it's tying up our court time, and it's just bad public policy to have different actions in different places.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Yes, Senator Barker.
Just to follow up on Senator Russ' comments there, I think this is obviously a very significant issue and has huge potential implications long-term. And I think that working with the lottery and others, it would be helpful to have our staff, keep us apprised of sort of how this is going along. The change from just July to August was significant. And, we are in a position where we could lose hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that we now apply to K-12 education.
We are continuing to track in real time, Senator Barker.
All right, well, Kevin, thank you for your presentation. I hope your hard help is working out well for you.
Thank you. Yes.
Good, good. And I think Senator Norman has made it very clear it's on the radar up here, so we will be following up on this, I'm sure, or individuals will be. All right. Our next presentation, Virginia Department of Emergency Management. Jeff, good to have you here today. Hurricane season, I guess you're.
Yes, it is.
Kinda.
I know that's a topic for us here. I'm Jeff Stern, committee members, Senators Norman, Hanger, thank you for having me here. I want to address very briefly the first half of the presentation. I'll be very brief. You can review the slides at pleasure, and we can follow up in detail. But there's four things I do want to touch on. The first two are Virginia's evolving risk environment since 9/11. We obviously just had that anniversary last week. The declining federal grant support for local and state emergency management and homeland security programs, and really want to emphasize that talking about support to your local emergency management, fire departments, police departments, and sheriff's agencies that underpin what we call the emergency management system. I'll breeze through that very quickly, and then focus on the status of FEMA disaster aid and the shelter reimbursements from last year and the corrective actions we've taken in response to APA's audit. So I will go through that again very, very quickly. The first piece of this is to discuss the evolving risk environment since 9/11. And it's important to understand that the Department of Emergency Management is not just a natural hazards agency. We are a all hazards agency, and we have a role in terrorist events, the shootings that occur, for prevention, mitigation, response, and recovery. We do a lot of training of local first responders, city and county agencies, exercising and assisting them with planning. And unfortunately, since 9/11, the risks in the Commonwealth have increased. In the type of risks, we see things like cybersecurity, obviously the changing nature of the lone wolf terrorists, civil unrest like Charlottesville, and this very much taxes the agency and the local emergency managers in order to match our training and exercises and our plans and our response capabilities to those evolving and increasing risks. We also see the changing nature of storms, which are intensifying more quickly. And as we know, hurricanes impact statewide. We just had the 50th anniversary of Hurricane Camille. I believe this week was the anniversary of Hurricane Floyd. This picture shows the governor and I touring Mount Carmel Baptist Church, which was destroyed in Danville. Their pastor died during the storm, tragically. And our goal, our mission, what gets us up every single day is to assist the local governments that you represent, the citizens you represent, in helping them prepare and respond and recover. And we even have a role in the series of shootings that have gone on since Virginia Tech and onward up to recently Virginia Beach. So we assist, for example, in the aftermath with setting up family assistance centers. We assist with, again, doing a lot of preparedness. We have a grant from the Department of Homeland Security for what are called complex coordinated attacks, where we have trained over 1,400 local first responders in how to deal with these. I do want to pause briefly on the hurricane vulnerability slide. This is our slide representing the tiered evacuation zone system that was put in place in 2017. And the important thing here I want to show is that the overall numbers of citizens at risk in these zones, we just had completed this year an updated study from the Army Corps of Engineers, and the citizen totals are up since last year by about 200,000 in total, from 1.1 million to 1.3 million citizens in all four zones. And in Zone A, the zone that we evacuated last year, and that was partially evacuated by localities during Hurricane Dorian 10 days ago, the total numbers in those zones are 287,000. That's up 42,000 in the highest risk right on the coast zones. We use, the reason these numbers are so important in addition to planning for citizens at risk is we use data-driven processes to make these decisions. And the data, the number of citizens, the capacity of the roadways, all is important in the timelines, the decisions, the recommendations we make. To evacuate all four of these zones would take 89 hours. So we're looking at almost 4 days of evacuation, and the storms, unfortunately, don't give us, as we know, they're very unpredictable, that linear track. Obviously, we try to do some mitigation related to sea level rise. My overall point is that the risks have increased in complexity that we are trying to deal with. And then the second piece of this presentation is we are doing this at the local and state level in a declining federal grant environment. Since 9/11 and since Katrina, we have relied heavily on Department of Homeland Security and FEMA grant funds. They are down from their peak funds supporting your local governments, your citizens, 70% from their heights. And you can see the red line here represents that pass-through money to localities, and you can see that is down steeply. Even for my agency, we're down about half, about 50%, about $10 million from where we were at in 2008, while trying to sustain programs and keep up with that changing risk environment. The real effect on this slide is we have about $30 million less per year in federal grant money to support this emergency management system, most of which is getting passed through to your local governments. I'll skip past this slide. This just reflects the agency general fund budget. We do have fixed costs. This fits into the APA study that have gone up over time. And so these slides, again, are available for you to look at in detail. Headquarters rent, for example, that's done through the Department of General Services, up 82% since 2003. We are getting ready to lease a new facility and move into that in the next 2 months that we believe will save about $1.5 million over the 10-year life of that lease. Obviously, we don't control insurance costs. We were working very closely with the Virginia Information Technology Agency. Nelson Moe and I are on speed dial, very close terms, to see how we can drive down the technology costs in the agency. When I started as a first responder, as a firefighter in Arlington County, Virginia, and a member of their emergency management team deploying to Hurricanes Charlie and Katrina in 2004 and 2005, BlackBerries were sort of the state of our technology. Now we use a lot of high-cost web-based systems to interact with every single locality and to do logistics ordering. We put a lot of cost controls in place last year as these federal grants have come down, and so last year we actually took $5 million at the beginning of the fiscal year and found cost savings. Mainly the key piece on this slide is we are operating at 80% of our authorized staffing, our authorized MEL. That is the lowest in the Public Safety and Homeland Security Secretariat. I believe DHRM did a study last year, showed everybody else is about 90%. We're at 80%. That has an impact for a small agency. We have about 130 employees out of the 160 we're authorized. There's also an impact of these cuts to your local first responders. We had to cut back one search and rescue academy for the folks that go out, and we have 21 volunteer teams with about 500 to 600 volunteer, very professional wilderness search and rescuers. They do about 120 missions a year. We had to cut one of their training academies. We had to cut some hazmat training programs. We also stopped sending what we call our special operations teams, our technical rescue incident management teams, our radio cache teams, to incidents when there's not a governor's state of emergency. They can still go on local mutual aid, but we took that out of our automatic ability to respond. We were successfully able to, because we've been tracking our revenues and our costs very closely, close out the fiscal year on budget. So I just wanted to skim on that. Again, the main context is that the risks have increased and the federal grant support has decreased. That underpins the emergency management system. Over 80% of our agency budget comes from these federal supports, federal support grants, a wide variety of them.
Before we move on, because I think the shelter information is going to be a little bit different than this part, of that federal grant reduction, how many of that goes to actual agency operation or staff versus a pass-through to localities?
So the green line, I'm on page 9 here, I think. The green line represents funding retained at the Department of Emergency Management on this slide. That is slide 9. And so you'll see it at a height in 2008, it was just under $20 million, probably about 18. We'll get you the exact number after. And last year, we're getting just under 10 million. I think it's between $8 and $9 million. So this is based on a wide variety of federal grants: emergency management performance grants, the state Homeland Security grant, port security grants, the urban area security initiative grants. We were successful a few years ago in getting the Hampton Roads urban area restored. That had been eliminated by the Department of Homeland Security. And so that, again, the red line is the pass-through.
Mr. Chairman, so if I'm reading this correctly, it looks like it's, even though it's down from 2008, it's been fairly constant since 2014.
That's since 2014, yes. But the challenge for us is now the local hazmat teams, the local technical rescue teams, the incident management teams that were built up after 9/11 and Katrina. Their equipment gets old, their staff changes over. We're at that about 10 to 12-year cycle where they need to recapitalize, would be the term, a lot of that equipment, and we're trying to do it with 30 cents on the dollar that was available a decade ago, sir.
Okay.
All right, so I know this is of high interest, and the main focus, I want to touch on the FEMA disaster aid. First of all, to give a snapshot of how much emergencies and disasters cost the Commonwealth, this slide on page 15 shows these are the active open disaster recoveries we have ongoing across the entirety of the Commonwealth just from 2018 and 19. 92 localities we're supporting with 133 different disaster recovery operations. The total cost over the 2 years to date is roughly $187 million. Now, that is cost borne by the localities. Some is insured. Not all of this, this is not a cost that's coming necessarily from the Commonwealth at all, but I just wanted to give you an order of magnitude of what flooding, tornadoes, the hurricanes, the civil unrest incidents, and other various events cost. On slide 16, This is where we get into the detail. This is the FEMA disaster aid. These are specific disasters that reach a level of what's called a presidential disaster declaration that makes federal aid available in the aftermath of disasters. And so going back to 2009, this slide captures the status of all of these disaster recovery operations. The green lines at the top three are what we call closed out. That means all the paperwork's been done with FEMA, with the state, with DPB, and we're just tracking that as a historical event. The yellow lines mean that the disaster has been closed with FEMA, but we still have state finances that we are tracking with the localities or with DPB, mostly related to mitigation funding, which is additional funding that the federal government provides us in the aftermath of a disaster to reduce the risk of that event happening again. And then the orange lines at the bottom are our active open disasters that we are working with the localities, other state agencies, and FEMA. The line for Hurricane Florence is second from the bottom in the orange, and it shows the cost for Florence, where we incurred the sheltering costs. Overall, including damages, was $45 million. That's state and local costs and damages. The amount of that total cost that's eligible, and so that was in column 6. In column 10, it shows $34,209,000. That's the amount of that total cost that is eligible for FEMA reimbursement at various levels. It's generally around 75%, but there are different categories where they give us 100% and some there's a share. So we expect to get back from Florence $24,700,000 from FEMA, and we've already received or will receive the checks in the mail, so to speak, this week, $17,211,000. And we expect to get the rest over the next 6 to 12 months. As you all know from watching the news, FEMA has been burdened with a lot of disasters, more so in the last 2 years than in their entire history. They are process-driven, very burdensome. They don't make things easy. We've gotten back within 12 months about 50% of our disaster aid that we're eligible for both Hurricanes Florence and Hurricane Michael. By comparison, I spoke to my counterpart in California, the Paradise Fire, the terrible wildfire, over $1 billion incident. They've only gotten back 6% of their federal funding. In Texas, from Hurricane Harvey from 2 years ago, I spoke to my counterpart there. They have only gotten back 15% of their money from a disaster 2 years ago. They've gotten back $416 million to date out of a $2.8 billion disaster level. So our processes are working. We put a lot of changes in place to modernize our disaster recovery programs in the last 4 years. One of the things we did was we put our programs under our CFO. We actually eliminated our separate recovery division, and we were able to close out about 1,800 old disasters going back to the last decade, and we returned over $100 million back to the state treasury or to local governments by improving that process. And so that's something that we're continuing to work and evolve on. The quick reminder, it was 53 weeks ago, we were facing what the National Hurricane Center director told us on September 11th last year, a catastrophic storm, Category 4, that we have not seen in 150 years. With that was supposed to be tremendous inland flooding. By comparison, Hurricane Dorian last week, the governors of Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and even here in Virginia, we all had evacuations from the coast. Millions of people were evacuated with Dorian as it was bearing down as a major storm on Florida. Florida, I spoke to my counterpart there, incurred $82 million in costs just to take those preventative measures. I have talked with Secretary Lane. There are some things, preparedness is expensive. There are some things that we can look at potentially. Some local governments in some states are starting to look at something called parametric insurance, which is measured insurance that automatically pays out when certain criteria are going to. Yeah, that Dorian is the one for Alabama. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Exactly. Now, the cost of the shelters were high. This slide reflects a comparison of what it costs to have a private sector contractor provide sheltering. We looked at other shelter operations provided the same way across other states. It's very, very high. The challenge here is, and what we found out was we were right in the middle of the range, sort of range from a low of $395 to a high of $997. And when we executed it, it was to build that capacity for 6,000 people. I know that right now this is, again, as a reminder, this is was a 2006 Department of Social Services plan to execute the state managed shelter system. We had never had to execute it before. We believe that the overall cost once we get all the FEMA funding back to the Commonwealth will be $7.7 million, and that, again, the FEMA share will be $23 million. We're working very closely with DSS, Commissioner Storin, Department of General Services to support the task that you've given to Secretary Lane to look at emergency procurement processes and costs and different ways of doing this. We are looking at how we can enhance sheltering at the local level. But again, when you have a major once-a-century storm with the numbers of citizens, we have very little recourse but to do the right effort to do anything we can to save their lives. This next slide shows the actual damages from both Florence and Michael. When we say damages, the public assistance projects, this is expected aid from FEMA. You can see that it's affected across the entirety of the state. And so these are projects that we were actively running to support local governments to help reimburse them or to help assist with some of the damages. As I showed the picture of the Mount Carmel Baptist Church earlier, that's an example of one of these projects. It's a total of $95 million in damages and costs. At your request, I know the Office of the State Inspector General and the Auditor of Public Accounts looked at the sheltering operation that we executed on behalf of DSS. They did not find any evidence that those costs were inappropriate or unnecessary given that circumstance. The state of Louisiana's Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness was brought in to do an after-action review. I'm not going to read this in detail other than the bottom two paragraphs that they did see in Torhampton roads and saw the potential for the unimaginable catastrophic damage and flooding that would be possible. And I do appreciate their expression that Mother Nature does have a role in how this played out. The storm took a 17% track. Just had the lottery up here talking about it from a gambling perspective. We had an 83% chance of having a catastrophe. We lucked out at the expense of our fellow citizens in North Carolina. And this is important too. Old Dominion University came in. They did 2 studies after Florence. One was an economic study. What would be the impact of a major Category 3 storm? And they came up with some highlights. $40 billion in damage, 197,000 permanently lost jobs, 27,000 homes destroyed out of the roughly 400,000 at risk, totally destroyed. And then what is really concerning to me is when we ordered the evacuation of Zone A last year, only 18% of the people evacuated. We typically our planning assumption is between 60 and 80%. That means the first responders are going to have a tremendous challenge in the aftermath if people don't get out of harm's way, and it's a huge cause for concern from a planning perspective. The state has made a lot of improvements in the last year as part of our continual efforts. I just want to highlight a few, but we did have Louisiana come in and make recommendations. They wanted us specifically to strengthen the ability of other agencies to execute their missions. So we are in the process of helping strengthen DSS so they can fully execute the shelter mission and make improvements there. We have updated, and the governor just signed several executive orders updating the Commonwealth of Virginia Emergency Operations Plan. It is streamlined and now very clear what different agencies' roles are. We've updated the old Executive Order 41 to focus on what state agencies need to do to be prepared and to carry out their missions. And we've simplified the executive order to actually declare a state of emergency like the 49 other states. It's now essentially a one-pager, and the bulk of the authorizing detail and delegated authorities now are reflected in that standing emergency operations plan. We held a cabinet-level exercise we had Governor Roy Cooper of North Carolina talk about to the cabinet what it was like to actually have a $40 billion storm that killed dozens of people impact them and what the long-term recovery challenges would be. And we've made several other updates, including last year in real time with Florence, and it's continued. The Department of Planning and Budget has access in real time to our logistics software, so they can see in real time what is being requested and ordered. And we're going to transfer the state sheltering. We're in the process of proposing the transfer of one MEL, the state sheltering coordinator position, to the Department of Social Services from VDEM to support them. I'm going to go now just very briefly. I have 2 slides on the APA audit corrective actions. By March, the APA had 5 findings. By March, we're in compliance with all 5. We continue to work on improving these processes on an ongoing basis. And then one of the things I do want to point out related to our staffing, APA looked very closely at 2015, 16, 17, and I know they were looking at the increase in number of staff, and we're concerned about that. Our staffing is still below our MEL. What we did was we got rid of contractors, and at the time from 2015, 16, 17, we were coming out of both a hiring freeze and I believe we had 26 retirements. The hiring freeze was put in place when we had the $2.5 billion budget deficit. And so the reason, when you look at those narrow years, the staffing was increasing, we were hiring on additional career staff. I'm happy to take your questions. I know you have some, and I'll do the best I can to answer.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Senator McDougall.
When I'm going back to page 19 of the slide. So a couple things. When I'm looking at, I'm not getting the numbers to come out the same that you have presented. I have 31,151,000 over at 5,775 in 7 days. I'm coming up with 770 a day, 770.59 a day. What's the discrepancy?
Yes, sir. The 650 is the cost for per person per day. There's a separate cost for the mobilization and demobilization. Basically, these contractors are bringing in 24 trucks, setting up stuff. So the way they do the contracts, those costs are separate.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, it doesn't seem separate to me when for us to put it together, it's $770. You don't typically take out the cost for construction, and deconstruction is typically added in. But the part that concerns me is we're talking about the estimated population. Refresh my recollection, but I think there were 58 people that stayed in the shelter. So doesn't that make it $537 and some odd per person?
Yeah, so when we're making the decision, and I was at the Superdome in New Orleans, we're buying the capacity for nearly 6,000 people with a Category 4 storm coming. The number of people that didn't show up was because the storm turned into North Carolina, which defied all the odds of what the National Hurricane Center had predicted. And so we are looking at ways, and we've been working tirelessly with DSS and DGS to look at, are there ways to reduce the overall cost to a contracted service, perhaps by breaking up the contracts into different contracts. I know the governor's budget and DSS last year requested $4.5 million to have enough sheltering supplies to at least deal with the folks related to Zone A. That was eliminated, I think, right out of the gate during the budget process earlier this year. But what we've bought was the capacity for 5,775 people, and our estimated need, I spoke to the head of the American Red Cross's sheltering services during the storm. They were estimating, based on their experience, that between Virginia and North Carolina, we were going to need sheltering for 100,000 people during the storm. Those were the data sort of inputs we were getting in that very tight time frame on September 11th last year, when we had to make this decision of, do we activate this shelter system for the first time since it was established in 2006.
Mr. Chairman, my recollection sitting through these same conversations last year in the after action was that we felt pretty strongly that this was not a good plan, and we had asked that y'all go back and come up with a better plan, specifically looking at private resources. As I look at this, the cost is $770 a person. That means it's about $3,500 for a family of 4. There are certainly some more cost-efficient options by putting people into actual hotels in other parts of the state that would actually help the economy while you're doing that. What plan have y'all produced, and can we see it?
Well, again, Social Services leads that. We're providing information to Secretary Lane so that he can make that presentation. I believe the main change that they've been working on is to support local shelters through a state-supported regional shelter plan more effectively, but these are the costs for the private sector solution. The challenge with hotels, FEMA does hotel housing for people in the aftermath of a disaster, but from a life-saving perspective, moving lots of people to hotels typically is not done because of the standpoint that it's very hard to take care of, especially folks that don't have transportation, have medical needs, special needs like that. But I would really have to defer the technical details of what evolution and the plans are being developed to Social Services. They are the lead agency.
Mr. Chairman, so I take that we don't have a new plan today that we can see.
This is still, we had in the cabinet level exercise, this is still the plan on the books. And again, until we have more capability at the local level or state resources through the budget process to be able to operationalize a shelter as a government function and not a private function, this is still our plan of
Mr.
record
Chairman,
today.
I can't express my frustration, and through this is now not a question, but a statement. When this plan for the sites were at universities, then we had to evacuate those students. They had to go somewhere else. That's not accounted for in these numbers. And I think we were pretty emphatic and direct that we expected to have a better plan. We are in the midst of a hurricane season right now. We could have been dealing with some pretty serious situations last week, and we don't have a better plan. That we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take students that are our public institutions and move them out. They're going to have to find places to go, and it's going to cost Virginian taxpayers. I don't care if the federal government is picking up part of the tab. They paid over $500,000 a person for them to stay at a university gymnasium type facility. There has to be a better way for us to do it. Mr. Chairman, I don't know what we need to do to get a better plan, but I think Virginians deserve a better plan.
Okay.
Yes, sir. I know it's being worked on. I do want a point of clarification. We don't direct the universities to evacuate students. Those decisions are made by the universities themselves, and the, I believe, original intent of this 2006 DSS plan was not to put a burden on the universities, hence they bring in all the sheltering supplies. But I understand your frustration, sir, and I know we're working on a lot of different options.
Dr. Stern, I think the secretary behind wanted to add something there with the...
Just wanted to add, since we will have more alternatives to you by the time November 1st is due, when I recognize that we did not have another plan, we are now working through that, and we'll have that in the report that's due to y'all. Jeff and his team have been giving us information, working with DGS, and we will have alternatives for you for that.
Okay. Because it does appear, and I know Senator McDougal and maybe Senator Stewart were both a little irritated last time when we spent all those dollars, and we're second guessing you, and you have to make tough decisions. But it does appear if that hurricane that Senator Saslaw was speaking of that almost went to Alabama, had it gone a little further, it would have triggered contracts that we would have had a similar situation again. Is that correct?
The paths of the storms are different. So Dorian was coming from the southwest to the northeast, would have had some evacuations than we did, for example, in Sandbridge, but a Category 1 or 2 storm, a lesser storm, is unlikely to trigger the state managed shelter system. That would be more local led. This was really triggered because the prediction was by the National Hurricane Center for a catastrophic level storm, Category 4, in one of the most densely populated and complex areas and vulnerable areas on the eastern seaboard. Okay. And again, we inherited that plan, and we're working to support DSS to make improvements in it and provide additional options in it. And I know DSS again had requested sheltering supplies on their own in the budget cycle. They didn't make it through last year, or this year, I guess.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
All right, we appreciate your presentation and look forward to working with you in the administration and Senator McDougal's committee to make sure that the plan gets updated. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Might I suggest that this be re-included for a future meeting, even if it's at the retreat? If there's going to be some new plan on November 1st, I don't know that we can wait another year, clearly based on the fact that no action has occurred in the previous year to review this again. So that's, I realize the chairman's prerogative to do that, but I'm asking that we might return this to the docket for a review in a time prior to January.
Mr. Secretary, Dr. Stern, you think that's realistic to have something available the third week in November?
Yes, it's due by November 1st, so
Okay.
we'll hope to have it well before then.
Okay, we'll see what we can do on that with staff.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Stewart?
and just a comment on the heels of that, there was a great deal of information about the sheltering, but I didn't see anything about the costs for some of these task force and rescue teams, and my recollection was that it was $1,000, $1,400 a person to house and feed some of these folks that you brought in to help. It was an extraordinary number that caught my attention, and I can't remember exactly what it was. But I'm wondering if we could have a follow-up on that and maybe a better plan there too, because that cumulative amount was also just off the charts.
Yeah, Senator, I appreciate you saying that. This all is reflected on the chart. I'm not sure exactly what pieces are. It's probably related to the original estimate for the two urban search and rescue teams, Fairfax and Virginia Beach. Fairfax team just got back from the Bahamas. Those costs were estimates that were very high in the initial estimate if we had needed them. We ended up not needing Fairfax. We incurred no cost for them. Virginia Beach, I believe, was about $500,000 in total cost. When we had estimated, we thought it might be $6 or $7 million. So there's a difference between the estimate and the actual cost. We really do only try to use them as needed, but we can follow up to get you the answer specifically on the breakdown of the special rescue teams and the other pieces that were brought in.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Senator Norman?
I was just going to say, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I bet I could find some hotels that would enter into a contingency emergency contract with you that would be willing to displace any pre-made reservations to house your emergency personnel or displaced personnel at the numbers you're talking about and feed them.
Okay. Sounds like a possibility there. Okay. Senator Norman, do you have anything additional?
No, sir.
April, we have anything additional? Okay. All right. We've concluded our business. The committee will rise. Yeah.